Good morning, friends and church family. This week in Pastor Donna's sermon series, we are now on steps 6 and 7. Step 6 says, we were entirely ready to have God remove these defects of character. Step 7 says, we humbly asked God to remove these shortcomings. Last week we discussed steps 4 and 5, and they gave us insight into our lesser character shortcomings. Our defects, if you will. And please don't be alarmed by the word defect. It doesn't mean we're defective. It simply refers to shortcomings from a different angle. We must be willing to sacrifice who we are now for what we can become in God's kingdom here on earth. We have already made a commitment to self-improvement. Remember in steps 1 through 5. And step 3 specifically asked us to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. So we are under new management. Steps 6 and 7 requires constant vigilance and practice. Like the soldier who was always standing his post, ready and guarding his fort, or as in Pastor Donna's metaphor of the garden, in order to be a more artful gardener, we are always ready to let nature, God if you will, dictate how the weeds and the needs of our own garden are going to be. A good gardener does not always weed once, does not necessarily put the same plants in the same spot year in and year out, and she does not tend her garden only in April. We are constantly tending, grooming, tilling, and weeding ourselves to be a better obedient child of God here on earth. When our instincts and desires drive us to exceed our needs and our basic satisfactions, something breaks, something gives. And this breakage, so to speak, manifests itself in destructive behavior. It did for me. Some of the more popular character defects are fear, pride, dishonesty, greed, lust, sloth, jealousy, grandiosity, and anger or rage. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? When I worked on my first 6th step, and still practice today, I learned that through the searching inventory that we did in step 4 and the confessions we did in step 5, that pride, grandiosity, and sarcasm were my immediate character stumbling blocks. You see, I came from a very large family and raised by a single parent, my father. And so I awkwardly learned how to brag. I learned how to show off. I learned to talk louder and well and much more than the others in order to get attention. And I'm one of 6 kids raised by a single father. And this also got me love, I thought. All my life and up to now, I still have to fight this. I thought that my way with words, that my talents and my smarts would get me and keep me ahead, keep me leading the pack. This notion, of course, leads me to stepping on the toes of others, and they do retaliate in kind. That's natural for them. And this is why all my relationships were toxic. They were retaliating against my grandiosity and my braggadocio. And this leads to woe is me, nobody loves me, and self-pity, which leads to alcohol abuse and other harmful self-inflicted wounds. I had to be ready to discard these notions. This was tough because I thought that my way was words, that my smarts was my way of up and out, which leads to the question I inventoried, remember in step 4, out of what and up to what? God just may have other plans for me, and they just may be better. So I prayed and prayed for help, and miracle of miracles, God does deliver. I can scroll through a Facebook meme now, and I don't have to put a sarcastic comment on it or say something hurtful to others. I can just move forward. That's a big step for me. Whereas step 6 readies us, step 7 readies us for action. Readies us for the humility to do the Lord's work. A simple action, but action nonetheless. For me, it is a quiet prayer of action, and it's something like this. I get to a quiet place and I fold my hands and bow my head, and I might say, Dear Lord, please remove from me those behaviors and notions that stand in my way of doing your will better and being helpful to others. It can be that, amen, of course. It can be that simple, but it's certainly not easy to practice. We must learn to practice that. My shortcomings are not ever completely removed. Of course they're not. But my behavior with this practice has improved greatly. My relationships in my life today are no longer toxic. I have learned that intimacy is not lust. I have learned that I do not have to speak my word and my sarcasm all the time. I learned that I don't have to be grandiose to be loved. And I've learned that being humble is not being weak. These notions and practices, my friends, are steps 6 and 7. Readiness and humility. And we must practice them to be the servant that God really wants us to be. In 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6, it admonishes us, and I quote, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. I pray that each one of you be lifted up, and that due time for you is sooner rather than later." Thank you all. Be well, and amen.